Okay, so research has shown again and again and again that retrieval practice combined with spaced repetition is the most powerful way to study and actually remember what you're learning. And flashcards are one of the best tools for doing exactly that. But for a long time, I used to feel like they didn't really work for me and that I was just wasting my time by spending hours creating and reviewing them. But that changed after I came across this article that made me realize I had been doing flashcards completely wrong. And after fixing my mistakes, flashcards have actually become my favorite study method for learning quickly. So yeah. Today, I want to share the most helpful tips from that article on how to create effective flashcards and actually use them properly. I'll also link the full article in the description if you want to dive deeper and check it out, which I highly recommend. Okay, so tip number 1 is to understand first, memorize later. The thing is, memorizing something you don't actually understand is pretty much useless. You might be able to recall the words on command, but you won't really know what they mean or why they matter or how they connect to the bigger picture. For example, memorizing that the hippocampus is involved in memory doesn't tell you how it contributes to memory formation or how it works alongside other parts of the brain. And without that web of neural connections, the fact just floats in isolation, which makes it way harder to actually memorize. The thing is, flashcards aren't for learning new information. They're for strengthening recall of the stuff you already understand. So if a concept still feels unclear, don't rush to make a flashcard for it. Go back, find a different explanation, watch another video, or read another example until you have that light bulb moment. Then you can make a flashcard. All right, so tip number 2 is to create flashcards while you're working your way through your academic material. This workflow helps you avoid a super common trap of using passive study techniques for memorization that aren't actually that effective, like rereading your textbook or highlighting and then rereading your highlights or taking notes and then rereading those notes like 5 billion times over. To actually memorize shit, you need to stop using passive study techniques and use active ones, like retrieval practice. That's why it's better to create flashcards of the stuff you need to know as you make progress through your learning material. Once you finish that material, you can just mark it as complete and then focus all of your study efforts on using the flashcards you created and not falling into the passive study trap. Okay, so tip number 3 is one that can be hard to get yourself to do, but is well worth the effort. And that is to craft the actual question and answer from your memory. As tempting as it is to copy and paste the content of a flashcard directly from your source material, writing the question and answer from memory gives you another chance to use active recall, which will only help your memory. It also forces you to put the concept or fact into your own words, which means you're not just passively copying text, you're actively reconstructing the idea in a way that makes sense to you. After you have a go of answering from your memory, then you can go back and refer to the source material to fill in any gaps and just make sure the answer is complete. All right, so tip number 4 is to, most of the time, only include one question and one answer for your flashcards. A good flashcard focuses on a single idea, so when you review it, you either know it or you don't. So instead of asking something like, how did the Neolithic Revolution change human life and lead to the rise of civilizations, which actually combines multiple ideas and would lead to a long-ass answer, you can break it into separate cards like, what change marks the start of the Neolithic Revolution, and what key technology allowed people to settle permanently during the Neolithic Revolution. Each question targets a single piece of the puzzle, which makes your learning much more precise and helps you build a stronger understanding over time. For tip number 5, we have to craft your flashcard questions to elicit the best and most complete answer. This doesn't mean include the answer in the question, but it does mean this. Don't create questions that are super vague or general or worded in a way that makes it impossible to come up with the right answer. You want to thoughtfully compose your questions to best interrogate your memory. So Instead of asking something like, what is classical conditioning, which could lead to a dozen different vague answers, ask something more specific, like, in classical conditioning, what is the difference between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus? That question forces you to recall a specific distinction rather than giving a vague definition, which helps you test your actual understanding. And tip number 6 is to, as a general rule of thumb, try to keep your questions longer than your answers. The thing is, writing essays on the back of your flashcards is a complete waste of time. Your brain isn't built to just remember a wall of text, and you'll end up just falling into the illusion of competence trap, where you feel like you know the material because it looks familiar and not because you can actually recall it. Keeping your answers short and precise forces you to focus on the key idea you're trying to remember. The goal isn't to memorize paragraphs, it's to trigger a longer internal discourse with yourself from a simple answer. Tip number 7 is to leverage the power of dual coding by adding visuals to your flashcards. Dual coding is the idea that your brain stores information in two ways: through words and through images. When you combine both, you're essentially giving your brain two different pathways to remember the same memory, which makes recall way easier. So whenever you can, add visuals like diagrams or charts or icons or drawings. They make abstract information more concrete and more memorable. Tip number 8 is to create flashcards intentionally. You don't want to make cards for every random fact you come across. You want to actually be selective. Each flashcard you create will add to your future review load and put more demand on your memory. So only make flashcards for the facts or concepts that you actually need or want to remember long term. If it's something you already know, or if it's just fluff, just skip it. Don't create a flashcard. The goal is to create your flashcard deck into a focused knowledge base and not a cluttered pile of trivia. Okay, so for tip number 9, we have craft why questions for your flashcards. An important concept in learning is called depth of processing, which just means the more deeply you process information, the more likely you are to remember it. And why questions naturally push you to think deeper. Like, knowing that something exists or is true is surface level knowledge, but understanding why something exists is much more profound. As an example, instead of only creating a flashcard asking what is photosynthesis, also create one asking why does photosynthesis exist in nature. That shift forces you to connect cause and effect, understand underlying principles, and engage with the material on a much deeper level, which will make it far more memorable. And for tip number 10, we have break down large collections of items into chunks. Sometimes you have to memorize a large list, like the 13 original American colonies, for example, but that doesn't mean you should just create one flashcard and dump that entire list onto it. Else you'll be fooled by fluency, the illusion that recognizing something is the same as knowing it. But again, fluency is not the same as being able to actually recall the information from memory. So when you're trying to memorize a long list of items, instead of cramming them all into one flashcard, break them into smaller, more manageable chunks. Essentially, you want to create multiple cards that each target a specific subset of the overall list. For example, instead of asking what were the 13 original American colonies and trying to remember all 13 at once on one flashcard, you could break them up regionally and ask which colonies made up New England, which colonies were part of the Middle Colonies, and which colonies belong to the Southern Colonies. That way, each flashcard tests a smaller, distinct piece of the puzzle, making it way easier to remember the entire list over time. And yeah, those are the 10 tips on how to actually create effective flashcards, but putting them together is only half the battle. The other half is how you actually use them. So to really make the most out of your flashcard, here are 7 more tips on how to practice them in the right way. So the first tip is to actually make a solid effort to retrieve the answer from memory. It's called retrieval practice for a reason. So always make sure to try your best to recall the answer before you flip the card over. Even if you can't remember it fully, that failed attempt will still strengthen your memory and make it easier to recall next time. It's for this reason I like to actually write out my answers before flipping over the card, since it really forces me to try and answer and shows me what I don't know. And my go-to software to do this is smarterhuman.ai, since it has this feature built in. For tip number 2, we have perform retrieval practice on your phone when you're out and about. The more practice you get in, the better, and this can be especially helpful if you're short on time. But beyond that, doing flashcards in different contexts, like while you're waiting in line or sitting on the bus, also helps your brain form new associations with the same memory, which will make it easier to retrieve later, no matter where you are. Tip number 3 is when practicing your flashcards, respond out loud. This engages you more deeply in the learning process, something called metacognition, or thinking about your thinking. Like dual coding, it activates multiple systems at once, including your motor cortex, auditory cortex, and language centers. Plus, saying the answer out loud gives you instant feedback, because if you hesitate or stumble or can't finish your sentence, you know exactly what you need to work on. And for tip number 4, we have, if you struggle with an answer, refresh your memory by going back to the source material. If you keep getting an answer wrong, don't just keep banging your head against the wall and guessing and then moving on. Go back to your textbook or your lecture to refresh your understanding. This strengthens the connection between your flashcards and the original context, helping reinforce the correct information in your memory. And it may also inspire you to just create your flashcard differently. Tip number 5 is try studying at different times of the day and at multiple locations. Varying when and where you study can actually improve recall by a lot. Each time you retrieve a memory, your brain slightly rewires it, and the context around you, like the room or the lighting or even time of day, adds new associations. These extra cues create more pathways for your brain to access that information later, making your memory more flexible and more durable. And for tip number 6, we have practice before you sleep. Memory consolidation, or the process of turning new memories into long-term ones, happens mainly when your brain is offline, like when you're relaxing or sleeping. That's why studying right before bed can help solidify what you just learned. And it doesn't have to be your full study session, just a quick review or retrieval practice before you sleep can make a big difference. And for the last tip, we have break up your flashcard sessions into several chunks. If you've got a lot of flashcards to get through, don't just power through them all in one 2-hour sitting. Your focus and attention will start dropping after about 30 minutes, which is why you should break up your practice into shorter, more focused sessions throughout the day. You can use the Pomodoro technique or just fit small study bursts around your schedule to ensure you're always optimally focused as you study. And yeah, those are all the tips I learned recently that has completely changed how I use flashcards for the better and has made my learning process so much easier and so much more effective. I hope you found this video helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more learning content. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.